You think of the way that you find topics that you're going to speak on, and a lot of the topics that I find, such as the one this morning, Pat actually was reading to me off of something that you'd seen on the internet, and that's where that lesson originated, and the general outline for it was found. And sometimes you have things to happen that kind of remind you of some truth that needs some discussion. Sometimes you're simply reading God's Word, and you come across something and you think about how important that is for people to give some thought to. One of the things that I found, and I almost entitled this lesson something different than what I did, I chose a much simpler title. This particular study is going to be taken from Ephesians chapter 5, the first 14 verses. In the beginning, I had thought about entitling this, I studied the other half of the book of Ephesians 5. Ephesians 5 is one of those chapters that has some monumental truths that people have turned to, and there have been so many studies of over and over and over again. For example, Ephesians 5 is one of the two passages, this according to Colossians 3:17, in which we make extensive arguments concerning the use of instrumental music in worship. In Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 19, there's that famous passage, speaking to yourselves in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing, make melody in your heart. So when you say Ephesians 5, a lot of people think of that, or they think about what begins in verse 22 and goes to the end of the chapter, where God gives a description of the outline of the home. Husband being the head of the wife is to submit herself to her husband, and his husband should love his wife as his own body. No man ever loved his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it. And everyone remembers that. But most people probably are not really familiar with Ephesians 5, verse 1 through 14, because it's not something we turn to often. We look at the instrumental music question, we look at the arrangement for the home, but sometimes we don't think about the rest of this chapter, that is the beginning of this chapter. This chapter, I finally hit upon this title, and this is one of those lessons we're going to stick pretty much to this text, and we're not going to do a lot of roaming around. This chapter talks about what really constitutes a follower of God. And the reason this kind of stuck in my mind as I was reading it is because I observe certain television shows that have celebrities on them that are noted to be religious people. And I've occasionally, as I turn through the various networks, I see these celebrities, and they're on various networks such as Trinity Broadcast and others that have religious programming. And they're used as guests, and they talk a great deal about their relationship with God and how important God is to them and all this kind of thing. And then sometimes I look and I see and I hear on the radio interviews with people who are into what is sometimes just generally called Christian music. And these people are talking about all that. But one of the things that kind of really sticks in my craw, I guess, for lack of a better term, is when I'm watching some celebrity and they're talking about on these religious networks about how important their relationship with God is. And then I watch them on another show, and profanity and just ugly talk is just commonplace. And it makes me to wonder what people think being a follower of God really is. I mean, what is being a follower of God? Well, that's why I thought that I would just stick to this particular passage, and that we would just look at what's revealed there and talk about it and not really roam around a lot. You know, I got to doing this occasionally, and what I found is this, and it kind of amazes me. You know, you spend a lot of time putting together a lesson where you go and you get a little piece of this, a little piece of that, kind of like making a pie and you have a recipe and you put it together and you think, oh boy, how great this is, and then you preach it, and sometimes folks really don't pay much attention to it. But I've preached several lessons recently that have basically been textual studies, just looking at the text itself and how people come out and talk about that's one of the best lessons I've heard. And I thought, that's the simplest thing that's ever been. But that may be the way it usually is. Things that are simple generally have a great deal of appeal. Before we get into a study of Ephesians 5, there is something I do want to go to and I do want to think a little bit about. The Apostle Paul, in writing the book of 1 Corinthians, wrote a letter that, and I think without a question, the book of 1 Corinthians is probably the most negative book in the New Testament. I don't believe there's any doubt about that. It has very little by way of positive statements within it. For the most part, it is pointing out the many flaws of the congregation there at Corinth. One of those things that he talks about that was a horrible occasion is what's talked about there in 1 Corinthians 5, where he talks about the man who was involved in such a horrid case of adultery that he had his father's wife. And the church there was encouraged to take some action against the man, to withdraw fellowship from him so that he might come to his senses. Now, when you come to 2 Corinthians 2, you can't prove that that's what this is about, and I'm not certain that it is. But it does fit the case, whether it is exactly the specific thing he's talking about or not, because he's talking to them about what to do when such a person is in fact so impressed that he changes his ways, repents, and returns to faithful service to God. Well, his idea is that sometimes we have a problem with that. We have a problem in just giving it up. And sometimes it's like you say, well, once a person's involved in that kind of thing, they always are. And so we just kind of ignore it. And so he in the 2 Corinthian letter in verse 2, he says in verse 7 that when a person changes and asks for forgiveness, he said that contrariwise you ought rather forgive him and comfort him, lest perhaps such an one should be swallowed up with overmuch sorrow. Well, in the process of this discussion, down in verse 11, he talks about Satan's devices. He says, we need to be careful that we forgive this person, because if we don't, and if we continue to, shall we say, hold him accountable for something that he's repented of and that we have supposedly forgiven him of, that we may in fact drive a wedge and drive him away from the Lord again. And what he says in verse 11 is very interesting. He said we would be careful not to do that, lest Satan should get an advantage of us, for we are not ignorant of his devices. Now you notice he used the word devices. So while this is a device that Satan uses to destroy people, to say, well, people don't really forgive you, they don't really care about you, that's not the only device that Satan has. When I come to Ephesians chapter 5, and the first words there are, be ye therefore followers of God as dear children, in my mind, when I look at what I see taking place in the world in many places, in the lives of many people, I believe that Satan has a device there too. And Satan's device is that, it's kind of like, if you remember, in the days of Moses, when he was sent by God to Pharaoh to secure deliverance for the people of God, and he goes into Pharaoh and he says that God has demanded to let my people go, and Pharaoh says, okay, you can go, but only a little ways into the wilderness, and you can't take your women and children. In other words, you can kind of go along with God, but don't get too excited about it, because that would be a bad thing. Sometimes I think that's really what's taking place in the world today. It looks to me like that what Satan is trying to do, that one of his devices is to convince us that being a follower of God is not an all-consuming thing. It's not something in which we really devote ourselves to. It's something we can kind of just kind of a little part of our life, and it's not, not get too excited and not worry too much about it. Well, when you begin to read this, it really appears to me, and I may be wrong, But it appears to me that that's exactly what Paul's dealing with. That's exactly what he's dealing with. He's dealing with that idea. Because I want you to notice as it progresses what he has to say to them and the way in which these ideas are expressed. What really constitutes a follower of God? In verse 2, he says that we're to walk in love, as Christ also hath loved us, and hath given himself for us, an offering and a sacrifice to God for a sweet-smelling savor. Have you ever thought about what most people's idea of love is? Have you looked at the world today and you examine when people are talking about Christians and what constitutes love? Just think about this, for example. If you today make a public statement that you believe that same-sex marriage is immoral, do you know what the statement that would be made in rebuttal to that would be? You don't love those folks. You're filled with hate. That's what the statement would be. If you say that you believe that homosexuality is, in fact, a sinful act, then you're told, well, you just hate those people. If you say to someone, one of the other major problems in our society we've talked a great deal about abortion, oh, you just don't love those women. Well, here's the problem. Here's the problem. When you look at Jesus, and he loved us, and there's no question about that, and we're to walk in love as he did, now what does that mean? Let's suppose that there's a person that's drowning in a lake. And I come by, and I'm going to try to rescue him. And he says, oh, no, there's really no danger. Then I'm going to ignore that statement and just say, okay, I'll just let you drown if you don't think there's any problem here. Do you think that would be love? Well, of course it's not. And that's basically what we're being told here. You know, if we love people like Jesus loved people, then what we're going to be doing is pointing out what is right behavior and what is wrong behavior according to the inspired Scripture, and we can't make excuse for things that people are doing and say, oh, well, you know, we love them, so therefore everything's all right. That's not being a follower of God. You examine the life of Christ and you give me one example where Jesus looked at a person involved in sin and said, it's all right, it doesn't make any difference, we don't care. Just find it for me and show it to me and make me to understand. I don't believe that that is being a follower of God, but it's what we're kind of being told today. Don't get too involved. Oh, yeah, you love people, but you know, you just have to kind of be careful. Now, let's think about this, though. You know, one of the other things that kind of came out as I was beginning my introduction there is that moral behavior is separated today, in many cases, from our relationship with God. Moral behavior is not considered to be a part of that relationship with God. Just think for a moment about what we're talking about. Same-sex marriage, homosexuality, promiscuous sexual activity. Just go down a list. And think about churches that those are commonplace. They are accepted, in fact, celebrated, as we pointed out in a lesson a couple of weeks ago, I believe. Celebrate that we're so all-inclusive that this doesn't matter. Just think about the way Paul begins this wording in verse 3 through 5. First word is but. But is a conjunction that shows contrast. He's obviously showing contrast here. And he's saying that, you know, people of the world may have an idea, but here's the truth. The truth is that fornication, all uncleanness, sometimes that is said to include homosexuality and homosexual behavior, or covetousness, let it not be once named among you, notice what he then says, as becometh saints. Neither filthiness, nor foolish talking, nor jesting, which are not convenient, but rather giving of thanks. And then he goes on to make a very strong statement. He said this, for this you know, that no whoremonger, nor unclean person, nor covetous man, who is an idolater, hath any inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and of God. Now you think about what a strong statement that is. Just think about your own people in your circle of acquaintance who are seemingly religious and look at their lives and answer a few questions. Do they consider sexual immorality to be a problem? Really not. It's something that their entertainment is filled with it. Everything around their life, they don't really pay any attention to it. It's like we just kind of ignore it. When you think about just any type of moral misbehavior, it's pretty commonplace. And here are folks who claim to be followers of God. Well, is that really a follower of God? Is it a follower of God? Well, he says not. He says that this type of moral misbehavior is such that that anyone participating in it has no inheritance in the kingdom of Christ of God. Now, that's a pretty strong statement. And yet the world today looks at this, and this is just commonplace. And I know you know what I'm saying. I know that every one of you have people who proclaim themselves to be religious people, and they think of themselves as being, everybody, and even some members of the church, unfortunately, have kind of adopted the same attitude. I have preached many times and talked about the fact, the first time that I ever saw this drawing that I've used many times since, that's a circle that has the various pieces sliced in triangles like pieces of a pie. The first time I ever saw anybody use that was a preacher by the name of James P. Miller, and he kind of made it famous. And what he was saying, in effect, was this. If you look at your life as a pie that makes up the whole, it's not really made up of slices. It doesn't have a slice that says, here's church. You go to church on Sunday morning, Sunday evening, Wednesday evening. That's church. Here's work. You go to work on Monday morning, and whatever applies to church doesn't apply here. That in church you have a certain set of behavior, certain way that you speak, certain things that are not permitted. But in the rest of your life, those things that are not permitted and that behavior that's acceptable there is not necessary. You don't really have to do it. It's a common problem. And it's something that I think people need to talk a great deal about and say to us, hey, if you want to be a Christian, understand something. Morality is a part of that. It's not just being baptized into Christ, which we talked about this morning. It's not just attending a worship service, which we talk about many times and encourage all of us to do. But there's more involved in it than that. And that's what Paul is saying to these people. Now, it may be, in looking back at the historical record, all of you are aware that if you go back to Acts 18, you see what took place in Acts 18 and 19 in the city of Ephesus. And that was where the great goddess Diana was located. And that's where Paul had all the conflict concerning the statues there. But understand one thing. Diana was a goddess of basically immorality, was involved in the worship, and so the people were very accustomed to it. So it may be that Paul is trying to break them from that. I'm not certain. But if that be true, then we're kind of in the same circumstance. How many folks do we know who think of religious experience and do not consider morality to play any significant part in that? And that is unfortunate, because God makes clear that it's very true that it does. Now, in verse 5 through 7, and it's kind of interesting what he says, and it goes back to what we talked about in the book of 2 Corinthians chapter 2 about the devices of Satan. He said this in verse 6. Let no man deceive you with vain words. Just think about for a moment what he's saying. Vain words are empty and useless words that serve no purpose. That's what they are. Those are the things that people use to deceive us with. They say things to us that are deceptive. Now, Paul talks about, as he talked to the young man Timothy, that there were teachers that would scratch your ears and people sought them out. Now, I know that I've talked about this so much, people get tired of hearing it. But if you think of Joel Osteen has a church of 27,000 people that meet on a Sunday morning. Maybe not all the time, but at least part of the time. He has publicly stated, I've heard him state several times in several different situations, that he did not ever talk about anything negative, period. That's what he said. So he didn't condemn anything. Now, if you've ever listened to him talk, he says that basically if you're a Christian, that means you go to the store and you smile at the clerk and you say hi and you have a general disposition. That's what he says. Have you ever heard him say that if you're a Christian, that means you are going to avoid fornication, that you're going to be careful about your language, that you're going to pay attention to how you view things that God refers to as a perversion? No. Now, when you think about that statement that Paul made about secure to yourselves, teachers having itching ears, and you just think about that, let me ask you a question. If, in fact, he suddenly had a sudden illumination in his mind, and he realized that what he had been doing was in error, and next Lord's Day morning he stood up and preached what some people would call a hellfire and brimstone lesson and talked about moral and how you can't use that kind of language, how you can't be involved in that kind of entertainment, how you can't be involved in that kind of relationships. The next Sunday, do you think you'd have 27,000 people? No, probably not. It might be, considering our current environment, that some people might just get up and walk out and just not even come back from that time forward. But notice what Paul said. Let no man deceive you with vain words. You expect he's deceiving some people? For because of these things cometh the wrath of God upon the children of disobedience. Be not ye therefore partakers with them. Now think about what he's saying. Just consider this. If a person is convincing individuals that sin is not a problem, that, hey, you have a relationship with God, you come to worship, you sing, and you pray, and everything's great, and how you live your life doesn't matter, will that change the situation? No, it won't. You know, that same James P. Miller also he was kind of a country kind of guy. He also had a line in one of his sermons that if you call a pig pen a chicken house, it doesn't make it a pig pen. What you call something has no relationship to reality. And so that's what he's talking about when he said, let no man deceive you with vain words. People try to convince you, hey, this is a Christian. But let me tell you what. God tells you what a Christian is. God says that a Christian is one been baptized to wash away his sins and then devotes himself to living a life in accord with God's will. And when he does sin, he recognizes that and he asks God's forgiveness and he proceeds on. That's what a Christian is. A Christian is not a person that says, oh, it doesn't really matter. That's not what a Christian is. Don't let men deceive you and make you believe that to be true. In verse 8 through 10, he says a number of things that are really interesting. He says, you were sometimes darkness, but now are the light of the Lord, light in the Lord. Walk as children of light. For the fruit of the Spirit is in all goodness. And go back to Galatians 5 to see what the fruit of the Spirit is, and righteousness and truth. And then he uses this statement, that's an interesting statement, proving what is acceptable unto the Lord. Now, he's not talking about proving in the sense of us trying to make arguments to prove it to be true. What he's getting at is that we are proving it in the sense that we are doing it so that we see the result of making it work. When he's talking about proving it, he's talking about it's part of your life. And he's saying, you know, you were sometime in darkness, but now you're in the light. Now, everybody probably in their lifetime has had the experience of pretty much total darkness. And you're trying to feel your way around in a situation that you're not overly familiar with. And all of a sudden the light comes on and you realize that you were nowhere close to where you thought that you ought to be. Probably everybody has had such an experience in your life. Light and darkness are total opposites. Have you ever been into a place, probably you have, like Ruby Falls, where you get down beneath the earth, you go down the elevator, they turn all the lights on, there's nothing there. Boy, I'm telling you, that's an eerie experience. It's almost like the darkness settles in upon you. And you know, you're standing there, and if you're a person that has a little claustrophobia or something, you may be getting a little eerie, and then all of a sudden they flip the light on you. Oh, boy, that's a great relief. That's kind of the way it is with God. We're walking through this life in darkness. You think of all the people in life who are just totally... I mean, think about it. Why do you think that drug abuse, alcohol abuse, and suicide are such huge problems? It's because people are kind of in darkness and they just totally confused and they're trying to grapple and find some way to deal with it. And that's the problem. And he says that in reality, the only way that you can ever deal with it is that you have the light of the Lord and it illuminates your way. Think about it. You're followers of God, or you're trying to be. How are you going to do that? God's going to direct you with His light, is the point that the inspired writer makes. In verse 11, he says something that's really important. Have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather reprove them. It's kind of a difficult passage for most of us. But his point really is pretty simple. What he's saying is that there's no halfway in being a Christian. You know, just think about, we talked about this morning, for example, in Acts 26, and you talked about old King Agrippa, and he said, almost thou persuaded me to be a Christian. Well, in today's world, that'd be all right. I say, all right, well, whatever part you're persuaded, then that's fine. You just walk in that way. And all these other things that you hadn't quite come to grips with yet, we just don't worry about those. We'll just leave those alone. And we really don't care. It's kind of the way the world does today. The world, in many cases, and I've used this illustration so many times, and I've wondered how anyone could believe it to be true. If back in the 1980s, when the Catholic Church was having such a terrible problem with so many, as they called them, priests, who were entering into their priesthood, and come to find out a lot of them were actually two things. They were homosexuals, they're also pedophiles. And they began to use their position to practice their sinful behavior. And you had a bishop, I believe it was the Bishop of Boston, who came on the air and said that their misconduct did not affect what they were doing in the carrying out of their official duties. I think I'll fall out of my chair when a man says a thing like that. I mean, we need to understand there's no halfway in being a Christian. We're either a Christian or we're not. Just like there's either light or there's darkness. I mean, you know, that's the way it is. There's complete darkness, and we turn on a light, and all of a sudden it's illuminated. But I'll tell you something else he says that's interesting too, that kind of is important. He says it's a shame even to speak of those things which are done to them in secret. When you begin to practice anything, and I don't care what it is, and you think it has to be done in secret, and you make sure that it's never known to anyone else because you'd be totally ashamed if it were known to someone else, then what does that tell you about it? What would that tell you about it? If there's something you're practicing in secret, and you would just be totally ashamed if anyone discovered it. Well, that tells you that's not acceptable behavior. That's not something that... For example, those so-called Catholic priests, when it was discovered, it put them in a bad place. Well, they ought to have known if it's something that you're not, you want to make sure nobody ever discovers, then there's a problem there. It's kind of a litmus test that you can use for your behavior. If this is something that you don't want anybody to know, then maybe it ought to be something you ought not do. Seems to be what the Apostle Paul is saying to them. But there's something that he says that's really important. He says it's a shame for them to speak of those things which are done of them in secret. But then he said this: are there any secrets? In reality, are there any secrets? He says all things that are reproved are made manifest by the light. For whatsoever doth make manifest is light. Now you think about it for a moment. I know that there are old songs in the book that we don't sing so much anymore. We do occasionally. One of them is, there's an all-seeing eye watching you. You ever think about that? It's gotten to where the world today has so changed that it's just a little bit frightening. We live in a world today where old-fashioned detective work, there was a lot of things done. But I watch a lot of detective-type shows today. Not detective shows, but I'm talking about real police activities where they go out and film them. And it amazes me that if there's a murder committed in any city, the first thing they do is they all start walking around looking for cameras. There's one. Let's go in and get the videotape. That's kind of the world we live in. If you go to Walmart now and you commit a crime, then they just get the videotape and put it on television and say, there's the man right there. Well, you might be able to escape the camera's view, but the point that Paul makes is you don't escape God's view. That whatever in your life is there, no matter how hard you try to make sure it's not discovered, God is fully aware of it. All things that are approved are made manifest by the light. And then the last point that he makes is this. To be a follower of God, we have to be aware of the origin of truth. Notice what he said. Awake thou that sleepest, arise from the dead, and Christ shall give you light. One of the things that bothers me in today's world is that we have a lot of people who are really interested in self-help and all that kind of thing. And we have all these books that are written. I've even noted several years ago that you'd buy books that would teach you how to teach the Bible. And you'd have all these things that are said there. But it kind of got to my attention and thought about, you know what? The truth is this. There's the Bible. Trying to have someone tell me how to make it palatable is kind of like when you're trying to feed your kids something, particularly medicine. You go to the grocery store, you go to the drugstore now, and it's kind of interesting. It wasn't true when our kids were small, but now you go up and you look and you get your prescription for your child, and then they have all these bottles, and there's grape and cherry and whatever other flavors they have, and all these things that you're going to use to kind of camouflage what they're taking so that it makes it palatable. Well, that's fine with medication. It gets your kid to take it. That's fine. But we have to be careful we don't understand that with the truth. I mean, we can't. Human wisdom and the wisdom of God are two different things. And human wisdom is always subject to error and may or may not lead us in the right direction, but the wisdom of God always will. And that's what the inspired writer is saying. A lot of people don't remember a lot of things. We think the world just went bad in the last few years and it's just gotten terrible. Back in the 1970s, the big thing that came out was what was called at that time situation ethics. And what it basically said was that sinful behavior is not necessarily sinful if it's in certain circumstances. And so you don't just look at the Bible and see that this is what God said, but you look at the Bible, see what God said, and then you look at the circumstances with your human wisdom and you decide, is it really true in this case? And you could apply that to almost anything. Whether you're talking about sexual misconduct, murder, stealing, whatever. Now, that hadn't really gone away because not long ago I heard a politician on a national interview say that some of the people who were rioting and stealing from these stores were just trying to get bread for their children, and that made everything all right. Does it? I mean, you stop and think. Does that really make everything all right? Do we have the right to just say, we're the ones who decide what's truth and what's not? He said, awake thou that sleepest. Don't let people deceive you. Don't be misled. Understand that there's only one source of truth. There used to be a bumper sticker that was very, very popular, and it said, God said it, I believe it, that settles it. And I used to argue with people and say, that's not accurate. That is not an accurate statement. What it should say is, God said it, that settles it, and I believe it. Because whether I believe it or not doesn't have anything to do with the truthfulness of it. It doesn't have anything to do with whether it has been settled. Forever thy word is settled in heaven, O God, has nothing to do with whether I believe it to be true or I don't. Romans 3 even asked the question, what if some men don't believe? Does that change it? No, it does not change it. So these are some of the things that I think of when I think about you being a follower of God. Just read that chapter sometime. Just read the first half of it. It's interesting to me that the last half of that chapter has gained so much notoriety that gospel preachers have preached so much about the instrumental music aspect of verse 19 there, particularly in verse 18 and 19, and preached so much about the home that what we've done is we've kind of forgotten that before any of that was introduced, that he talked about being a follower of God. Even introduced that into these two questions, into the instrumental music question. I mean, why would you object to it? Because it's not a part of the life that God revealed. When you look at the home and you don't order it in the way that God said, what's wrong with that? Because it's not ordered in the way that the life that God reveals. It's interesting to see that as we've been talking about lately, attitude is so important because it dictates actions. And this first part of this is telling you what makes a real follower of God. And it's an interesting thought. We're going to sing a song of encouragement. If you need to respond to the gospel invitation, we certainly encourage you to do that. Together we stand as we sing.